Hello, this is Attorney Travis Marker. I'm here with America Francis, and it's cozy, so I'm wearing a hoodie and t-shirt, and America's dressed up like a nice professional. But we're going to have kind of our podcast moment with conflict coaching, and today's theme we're going to explore emotions and conflict, and just kind of work through some of the elements relating to how emotions are important in conflict and can also be potential obstacles or distractions in conflict. So one of the first things I'm thinking is I had a client in the juvenile court a while back who was a grandmother, and she was actively trying to protect her grandchildren. She filed a protective order. She'd done, a lot of great things to protect her grandchildren from some abuse that had been happening by the hands of their biological father, unfortunately, and the mother. And the parents were they got a public defender, which is a court appointed option, so the court can appoint an attorney to represent parents. The grandparent did not qualify for a public defender because she was not um, she was intervening, and she is not like legally entitled to counsel. So one of the frustrations there was the fact that she's trying to save them and the court's giving them an attorney. And there was frustration about that. That was just one element of the frustration, is the emotions that come from not necessarily understanding the rules of the venue in which the conflict is happening, and how the rules of that venue impact what's happening. And they're not about it's not about good or bad or right or wrong or who's the good person, who's the bad person. It's about the processes that have kind of controlled the history of that conflict. It took a long time in the juvenile court for parents to get attorneys, and they were just kind of railroaded by the court system because they were bad parents who had neglected or abused their children. The question about whether they were in fact neglecting or abusing their children was a question for the court, but it was also a question oftentimes of public norms or historical norms or a variety of things that evolved. So, for example, there would be injustices that would take place with people of lower economic means, or like Indian tribes would have a lot of their children taken because of lower economic means, cultural standards about discipline, cultural standards regarding substance abuse. And so, as the process evolved, you had situations that then started to create fairness inside the system, which does not necessarily mean that fairness always represents good or bad or like virtue. It's just a process to establish what might have corrected historical wrongs, etc. So the grandmother's emotions were not misplaced. I mean, she can be in the spot of being frustrated about the process and the fact that her kids who are abusing her grandkids are entitled to counsel. Like, she could be frustrated about that, but there's also just the reality that sometimes even it doesn't mean that she should stay in that position once she understands she needs to move on because it's a reality. Like, it's not something she can change about the venue of the conflict. So some of the questions we had to explore with her is, does she have an option to change the venue, or how does she engage with where she's at inside the venue? What are your thoughts on that, America?
Ooh, you have so many good pieces here. So, some things that I've noticed, one of them is the gap between what she sees and what she wants is the place that's uncomfortable for her. And she needs to identify what it is that she's uncomfortable about and then look and see if it's possible to change it. And sometimes what you have to change is your thinking about it. All of these things are really great things we could move into.
Yeah, well, and I think ultimately you're correct. Like, what she had to see was that she needed the court be, because the court was going to give her the orders and the structure to help her provide ongoing continuity and support for her grandchildren in a safe and effective way. So she had to definitely change the way she was seeing the conflict in her mind, at least by way of her emotions and her frustration, because she needed to be able to trust the system that would allow her to eventually prevail.
I think a lot of people expect idealized institutions to deliver on that promise, and their idea of what that looks like can really be a difficult thing because they expect to see justice, and it's an imperfect process, whether it's education, whether it's the government, just the court system, whatever. If they expect it to have some high standard of making things right and it doesn't, that can lead to a lot of dissatisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's when we work in the idea of like it's not television, it's not,
Mhm.
literature, it's not, you have to get the information that will help you understand the venue in which your communication is taking place or your process is taking place. So as an attorney, I was able to work with my client to help her understand, again, it's okay for me to validate her emotions. And I think that that's critical. Sometimes we dismiss people's emotions and we say they just need to get over it, or it's just like, grow up, or, the one that I think is funny is when you hear people say, put your big boy pants on, and then I'll hear ladies say, like, put my big boy girl panties on. Like, all right, but it's okay to say, I need to adjust, but it's also okay to recognize that the frustration is still a valid frustration, or the feeling is still a valid feeling, or being heard is still valid. The question is, well, what is the context in which you're going to use that or work with that or move from that position to help advance yourself so you're not stuck in that obstruction that, even though valid, is still hindering your ultimate goals by way of, like in her case, getting custody of her grandkids. And she did ultimately win. Like, we were able to help her process her emotions as well as a variety of other frustrations that arose during the process, so that she ultimately was able to adopt her grandkids, and they were safe and they worked on. But I remember thinking at one point, I had to tell her what the way you're communicating your feelings is a distraction to the court, because the court
Mhm.
is not exactly sure why you're responding this way. Like, if you get on the stand and you tell a story in which you're just completely mad the whole time, that may or may not work, because you're telling a story under the influence of super heightened emotions, which the court through historical process has in essence devalued or
Mhm.
invalidated, because it doesn't appear to be authentic. It doesn't appear to be practical. I'm going to say this, like, this is often the case. Now, there may be scenarios in which someone is crying because they were raped. That is not a problem. Like, that makes sense. Like, that there's a corresponding connection between a person telling a traumatic story and crying. But there's often times where people just come at it mad, and oftentimes mad is a distraction, because it you're allowing anger to filter through your testimony in a way that doesn't necessarily show discretion or show that you're processing what's happening correctly. But trauma, I can say trauma is probably a pretty safe place to express yourself authentically. Um, but we also saw, like in the Johnny Depp trial, the wife trying to fake cry, and that didn't work, right? I mean, so whatever you're feeling, if it's authentic, can be fine, but you have to just be aware that sometimes the role of emotion can plays a certain way with people who are seeing it. I'll also just add, as I'm thinking, like, there was times where a person showed zero emotion and they should have been crying. And so you're kind of like, what's going on if you're not crying? Like, if there's nothing happening, like, because everybody else in the corner is crying, like, what's not happening? Sometimes that's okay. So there's lots of ways you can receive emotions when you're talking about evidence or you were talking about processing. But when we're talking about conflict coaching, what we're ultimately talking is the role it's playing for you personally in how you are engaging in the process. So, like with the grandma, it was a distraction for her because she was not able to process what was happening for her personally. There was the additional stuff that I was processing for her by way of the court or by way of evidence, but it was more important that we were addressing the way it was engaging with her specifically because it was not allowing her to process her choices and the moves inside the process very well. But what are your thoughts, America? Have you had any experiences with that? Because you're a mediator, you've experienced mediation. I mean, you're also a human being. Like, have you found that how you process emotions engages with your dispute resolution skills?
Absolutely. Definitely, when people are in a stressful situation, they're more likely to have trouble managing their emotions. And it's a symptom when they start escalating that they're not feeling heard. So, one thing you can do is to, like you said, validate those feelings. Even before you engage in any problem solving, you identify what's going on, or what you ask, is this what's going on for you? And then they say yes. And that just brief check-in can help them feel calm because there's another person helping them regulate.
Yeah, I think it's super important when you're able to be the intermediary or the mediator or neutral in a dispute that if you're going to be effective, you have to understand the parties first, particularly their emotional positions, because they feel heard and then they can start to process solutions that but if they don't feel heard, then they feel like they're chasing understanding. Like they're like, why can't you see me first? Like why do I have to get into problem solving if you don't even understand where I'm at?
Right. And another thing about that emotional piece is that that's a big advantage of mediation, is being able to include information that's emotional in the entire conversation. You get more information about what's going on than sometimes in the court where emotion is less accepted. You might miss some things, whereas if you can resolve some of the emotional things in the mediation because of the flexibility and the way the process works, you can make some good progress because the emotional stuff has been resolved.
Right. Yeah, because if it's not resolved, then you're not going to make any movement because they don't trust the process. They don't feel like they've been heard in the process. They don't feel like they've been addressed in the process. So they're like, why am I spending time on the other party who I already hate? Or like they like again, they're getting away with it. Like I had a conflict the other day I was working with, and the person had this situation where they were talking about accountability, and they said, how do we move from how do I move forward if they're not being held accountable? And obviously that's super valid because it's a feeling, right? Emotion, there's an emotion behind somebody getting away with stuff.
That is a justice thing. That's part of that complex emotion of anger. So that feeling of things aren't right here. And
Right,
definitely people cannot problem solve until they feel safe. So
right.
some of these, there's an order to it. And if you don't focus on the first things, you can't do the rest of it.
Correct. Yeah. And if somebody feels like it's not fair, fair is also another form of emotion, right? There's an emotion in fairness that relates to safety, relates to comfort, relates to security. Because if you feel like the process is going to be fair, then you're willing to be a bit more vulnerable by way of suggesting options for collaboration or suggesting options for, working things out. Yeah. So when I heard this person talk about accountability, that brought me into the mediation analysis that you'll often hear about. Like, what is your interest? Like, tell me why accountability is important, which is again in the category of how do I help you validate your situation? Well, I have to understand it first. So when somebody says I am pissed or angry or whatever, you can say, help me understand what you've experienced that is bringing it. Like I have my impression, so I can say like my impression is this is all happening, that's what's happening, but is my impression correct? And by way of me helping ask the questions that even might appear to be obvious, they hear it and they are able to shape it so that it's accurate. And then once we get to the point that it's accurate, then they can say, yes, I feel understood.
So the three words you start with are you saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Help me understand. Are you saying my impression is, um, because you're indicating that you're not saying it's in fact so, you're just asking for clarification based upon what you are personally receiving based upon the communication that's being given to you. But even with yourself, sometimes you have to say, um, I am very pissed right now. I'm very mad. I'm very sad. I'm very deregulated. I am out of control. I am, you know, there's that process of being aware of yourself. And sometimes when you do not have the benefit of a mediator or a benefit of a neutral or a benefit of an advocate like an attorney or, your friend, you have to you have to be able to somehow engage in a process that's self-arresting so that you can consciously identify where you're at. Because you may not be able to say, my impression of your feelings is blank, right? But you have to create something similar that says, why do I feel violated? Like, why do I feel betrayed? Why do I feel like this process is unfair? Like you have to explore what you're going through so you can say, why am I deregulated?
I just took a high conflict course with Bill Eddy, the High Conflict Institute, and that's one of the key pieces is that check in with yourself. Where am I right now? Is it working, or do I need to do something? Do I need to take a break? Do I need to ask for help? Do I, what needs to happen right now? Or am I fine to keep going? Because it can really help if you notice that early.
Yeah, and I can say with like surprising regularity, I've had clients who, when they draw the line and they have a barrier, it helps us create a more constructive conversation. Because if the client says to me, I just don't know how I can process this today. Sometimes as an advocate or as, in the law, lawyers get a little bit fixated on an outcome. And they're like, look, I'm a busy attorney. I've set the time aside today to get this done today. I need you to make this decision today or I'm walking.
Mm-hmm.
Which, like, strategically can be fair or it can be abusive. The same thing can happen with mediators. They there can be a sense of like, I'm the King Kong, like neutral of all things that resolve, and I'm going to make this dispute solved today.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's abusive. And I'm actually saying it abusive because if you are in somebody else's conflict and you're playing a role in their conflict, making them resolve it could be the worst possible thing that could happen.
Yeah.
I had to learn as a young mediator and as a young lawyer, like it's not mine. It's okay for it to not resolve.
Right.
Like I shouldn't be creating a conflict of interest in my need, in my agenda for my client. Now, if my client just needs to not resolve it that day because of whatever, my job is to make sure I can create the venue or avenues or resources for my client to potentially resolve it today if in fact it has to be resolved. So like you might have the situation where trial is tomorrow. If you don't resolve it, trial is tomorrow.
Yes.
But
Mistakes.
yeah, so there are definitely things that might be natural barriers that you do have to address. But if that's the case, I can say to my client, I can see that this is super important to you. So I'm validating.
Yeah.
I recognize that this is not the ideal time for you to resolve this dispute. The
Yeah.
reason why we're here is that we were trying to resolve it so we didn't have to go to trial. It's okay to go to trial, um, but we're also fairly close. So is there something we could do today that might give you space rather than us canceling the mediation or canceling or whatever, right?
And
Because
asking questions actually helps them calm down too,
yeah,
because they
correct.
have to think for a second.
Yeah, because their anxiety or their tension or their stress it's impeding their ability to govern the situation, even though they may